The night was thick with fog, wrapping around the bridge like a ghostly cloak. The only sound was the river below, rushing with an unforgiving current that swallowed everything it touched. He thought no one would ever know what he had done. He thought the darkness was on his side. He thought the river would erase his sin. But he didn't know that I had seen it all. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, one where secrets stayed hidden. My brother's wife, gentle, radiant, loyal, had been carrying the weight of betrayal that none of us yet knew. Her husband, powerful and arrogant, had been entangled with his mistress for months, intoxicated by lust and greed. To him, his wife was a chain, a burden that blocked his freedom. And so, under the cover of night, he led her to that bridge with sweet words on his tongue, but murder in his heart. He smiled as he leaned close to her, whispering false promises of love. She looked at him with such devotion, such pure trust, and for a moment I almost believed he might turn back. But then one sudden push, one gasp lost in the mist, and she was gone, swallowed by the river's roar. My blood froze, my fists clenched, but I did not move. Not yet. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the water, his chest rising with a twisted relief. Then he walked away, shoulders proud, as though he had freed himself of a curse. But curses have a way of returning. I knew I couldn't rush. Revenge, to be powerful, must be patient. If I confronted him that night, he would deny it, bury the truth, maybe even come for me next. No, I needed him to believe he was safe. I needed him to grow comfortable in his crime, to think the world had already forgotten. Only then would the knife of truth cut deepest. The days that followed were a masquerade. He pretended to grieve, to search desperately for his missing wife, shedding crocodile tears before the neighbors, shaking hands with the police as though he were a man broken by tragedy. His mistress clung to him, hidden but always near, already dreaming of taking the wife's place in his home, in his wealth, in his bed. But I was there, always there, watching. I studied their every move. The way he smiled too easily at the mistress when he thought no one was looking. The way he avoided the river, as though its voice still whispered her name at night. The way guilt flickered in his eyes when silence pressed too heavily in the room. He was strong on the outside, but inside he was already trembling. And then, one night, as I walked past his house, I heard it, his voice raised, trembling with fear. He was alone, yet shouting into the air, "Leave me!" I said, "Leave me alone." I stopped, hidden in the shadows, my lips curling. He had begun to see her, or at least believe he did. Guilt is a cruel companion. It dresses itself in shadows and whispers with the voices of the dead. That was when I knew the time was near. But revenge, my dear listener, is not only about striking back. It's about making the guilty destroy themselves. So I began to play with his mind, carefully, silently. A voice carried through the wind at night. A familiar perfume placed in the corner of his room. A single white scarf, identical to the one she had worn on the bridge, left at his doorstep without explanation. Little by little, I fed his terror. And oh, how he unraveled. His mistress, confused and furious, tried to hold him together, but the more she clung, the more he pushed her away. He began to drink heavily, his laughter turning into shouts in the middle of the night. He stopped sleeping, pacing his house like a hunted animal. Neighbors whispered that grief had driven him mad, but I knew better. He wasn't mad. He was haunted. One evening, he stormed into the bar where I sat quietly in the corner. His face was pale, his eyes red, his hands shaking as though he were fighting ghosts. He didn't notice me. He only screamed to anyone who would listen that she wasn't gone, that his wife had come back, that she followed him everywhere. The men around laughed nervously, thinking him drunk, but I saw the cracks. His soul was splintering. I leaned back in my chair, sipping slowly, savoring every second. My plan was working. Still, this was only the beginning. He left the bar, stumbling into the darkness, clutching at the air as though someone invisible was strangling him. I followed at a distance, my steps silent against the cobblestones. He had no idea that every shadow he feared, every breath he heard behind him, was me. He thought it was her, the wife he betrayed, returned from the river. But it was I who carried her voice into his nights, who pressed her memory into his conscience until it gnawed his sanity to pieces. The town began to whisper louder. They said grief had made him ill, that he had lost his grip on reality. But I knew it wasn't grief. Grief comes from love, and he had no love left in him. What was eating him alive was fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of truth. Fear that the woman he threw into the abyss had climbed out and returned, not in flesh, but in vengeance. I made sure of it. Every night, I slipped tokens of her life back into his world. A ring he had buried in a drawer, suddenly left on his table. A letter she once wrote, tucked into his coat pocket. A voice he thought he heard whisper his name in the hallway, though no one stood there. And sometimes, when the wind howled at the windows, I stood just beyond his door and called softly, "Why?" Nothing else. Just that single word, drenched in sorrow. He grew thinner, his cheeks hollow, his eyes wild. He began to avoid his mistress, shoving her away when she touched him. She screamed at him, accused him of losing his mind, of destroying everything they had planned together. But I watched the way her eyes flickered with doubt, the way she scanned dark corners, perhaps wondering if the wife had indeed returned to haunt them. Guilt spreads like fire. It burns everyone who stands too close. One evening, I cornered the mistress alone. She stood by the market, clutching a basket of fruit, when I stepped behind her and said quietly, "Does the river speak to you too?" She spun, her face pale, her lips trembling, unable to speak. I leaned closer and whispered, "She knows what you did, both of you." Then I left her there, frozen in the street, the oranges rolling from her basket onto the dirt. From that day, she stopped visiting his house at night. She avoided him, avoided his gaze, and the silence between them deepened into suspicion. He began to beg her not to leave him, falling to his knees in desperation, swearing that the wife's ghost was after him, not her. But her fear was too great, and her loyalty crumbled. She began telling others that he was dangerous, unstable, perhaps even violent. She was building her escape, leaving him alone in his madness. And alone he was, locked in his home with nothing but shadows for company. The house became his prison. Curtains drawn, doors bolted, mirrors covered as though he feared he might see her face staring back at him. I watched from outside, night after night, as he roamed through the halls muttering apologies, clutching his head, weeping like a child. And still it wasn't enough, because revenge wasn't just about fear. It was about truth. It was about making him confess. So, one stormy night, I carried my plan to its next step. I slipped into his house with the ease of a shadow, silent as the rain that lashed against the windows. He was in the living room, huddled on the floor with a bottle in his hand, trembling at every clap of thunder. I placed a white scarf, her scarf, the one he thought the river had stolen, on the table where he would see it. Then I stood in the corner, hidden in the dark, and waited. When his eyes lifted and landed on the scarf, he let out a scream so raw it rattled through the room. He scrambled backward, knocking over the bottle, his voice cracking. "No, no, it's not possible. I saw you fall. I saw you go under." He clutched at his hair, rocking himself, his words tumbling in a frenzy. "I didn't mean to. I had no choice. You were in the way. I had to do it." Those words, those perfect words, spilled into the silence, a confession no one could erase. I stepped from the shadows then, letting my face appear in the dim light. His eyes widened when he saw me, his breath caught like he had seen the dead herself. For a moment, I could see the question flicker in his gaze. Was I his wife returned, or merely flesh and blood carrying her vengeance? He could not tell. He did not care. His soul had already broken under the weight of what he had done. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence was heavier than any curse. He scrambled his feet, pointing a shaking finger at me, his words collapsing into sobs. It wasn't my fault. She drove me to it. I loved her, I did. But she wouldn't let me go. She wouldn't. His voice cracked into a howl as he staggered back against the wall. I left him there, broken, his confession echoing in the storm. I slipped away as quietly as I had entered, but I carried with me the victory of his collapse. His torment was no longer my doing. It was his own soul that devoured him now. And yet I was not done. No, his destruction had only begun to unfold, and I would be there to watch every piece of his empire burn. The next morning, Whispers spread like wildfire through the town. His mistress, unable to bear the weight of fear, had told anyone who would listen that he was dangerous, that he spoke of murder in his drunken fits, that he raved about pushing his wife from the bridge. People began to look at him differently, suspicion dancing in their eyes. The once respected man, admired for his wealth and charm, now looked like a criminal hiding behind trembling hands. The police returned to him, pressing him with questions, their eyes sharper this time, their tone less sympathetic. And though he tried to mask his panic, his answers betrayed him, every word dripping with guilt. They began searching again, combing the riverbank, digging through the mud for what remained of her. And every time they unearthed a shred of fabric, a piece of jewelry, he fell deeper into despair. At night, when the town grew quiet, I stood near his house and listened. His cries pierced the walls, pleas for forgiveness, desperate prayers to a God who no longer listened. He begged her ghost to leave him in peace, but she would never leave him. She lived in every shadow, in every drop of rain, in every whisper of the wind. And as long as I breathed, I would make sure her presence never faded from his mind. Because revenge was not a single strike. It was a slow, endless unraveling. And I was only just beginning. The storm that had shaken the town that night was nothing compared to the storm now consuming his life. His house, once filled with arrogance and pride, had become a tomb of shadows. Curtains always drawn, doors bolted, locks upon locks. But even with all his defenses, he could not shut out what was already inside him, his guilt. It roared louder than thunder, whispered deep in the wind, and sank sharper than the river that swallowed his wife. He had thought the water would hide his crime, that silence and lies would bury her memory. But I had ensured she lived on in every breath he took. The days stretched into weeks, and the proud man who once walked through town with his chin high now shuffled like a beggar, muttering to himself, hair unkempt, clothes disheveled. He had become a ghost long before death ever came for him. The mistress abandoned him in the end, fleeing with whispers of curses and hauntings on her lips, leaving him to his madness. The world he betrayed his wife returned to dust in his hands. Still, my work was not done. Revenge without revelation is hollow, and so I wove the final act, one so sharp, so devastating, that would pierce him in the one place he had no shield, before the eyes of the world. It was during the annual town gathering, a day of music, speeches, and pride. Everyone gathered in the square, men, women, children, officials, merchants. Laughter filled the air, but behind the laughter, there was tension. They all knew the whispers about him. They all waited to see if the rumors were true. And there he was, standing among them, trying desperately to look composed, his trembling hands hidden in his pockets, his eyes darting like a hunted animal's. His presence drew silence, a hush falling over the crowd. The air thickened with suspicion. I stepped forward, not in shadows this time, but in the open. My voice rose clear and steady, carrying over the crowd. A man who wears a mask of grief while hiding the blood on his hands does not deserve silence anymore. Heads turned, all eyes on me and then on him. His face drained of color, his lips quivering. "What are you saying?" he stammered, though the crowd could already sense the truth trembling behind my words. I reached into my coat and pulled out the white scarf, the one she wore the night he pushed her. The crowd gasped. "This," I said, holding it high, "was found on his table. This man did not lose his wife to tragedy. He murdered her with his own hands. I saw it. I heard his confession. And the river itself has begun to give her back to us." The murmurs erupted into shouts, the townsfolk pushing forward, anger rising like fire. He shook his head violently, denying, shouting, his voice cracking. "No. She was jealous. She wouldn't let me live. She drove me to it. I had no choice." His words, meant to protect him, were daggers to his own throat. The crowd recoiled at his admission, gasps cutting through the air. The police who had lingered at the edge of the gathering surged forward, seizing him by the arms as he thrashed and screamed. His once commanding voice was nothing but a shriek now, begging, pleading, cursing the ghost he swore never left his side. He cried out her name, demanded forgiveness, but the only answer was silence. As they dragged him away, the crowd parted like a sea, their eyes hard and cold. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers shook their heads, and whispers of murderer and monster followed him like chains. He, who once thought himself untouchable, was now nothing more than a trembling figure, dragged into the hands of justice. But justice was not only the prison bars that would cage him. Justice was the torment that would follow him until his last breath. Because no prison could be darker than the one he carried within himself. No guard could be stricter than the ghost of the woman he betrayed. She lived in his eyes, in his dreams, in every shadow that flickered on the walls of his cell. He could not escape her. He never would. The town buried her in the place she deserved. Not in the cold river that stole her, but in the earth that cherished her. People wept openly at her grave, not only for her life lost, but for the love she gave so selflessly, a love betrayed so cruelly. Flowers covered her resting place, and the wind carried her name with gentleness, as though the world itself tried to heal the wound left behind. I stood there, silent, my eyes fixed on the ground where she lay. My heart did not feel light, for revenge never brings light. It brings balance, and balance had been restored. The man who thought he could bury his crime in the water was now buried in the weight of his own deeds. The mistress who thought she would rise from another's ruin was now marked forever by fear and shame. And the woman they thought would be forgotten lived on, not as a victim, but as a voice that haunted, a soul that demanded justice. In the quiet that followed, I realized something. The story was no longer his. It was hers. She was not the woman who drowned that night on the bridge. She was the woman who rose from the river in the form of truth, who reclaimed her name, her dignity, her place in the memory of every person who stood in that town square. And through me, through my vengeance, she would never be silenced again. As for him, the once proud man, he became nothing more than a cautionary tale, a whisper parents told their children at night. Do not betray love. Do not mock loyalty, for the river remembers and the truth always returns. And when the years passed and the river flowed on with its endless current, the bridge where it all began became a place people visited not with fear, but with reverence. They laid flowers there. They prayed there. They whispered promises never to repeat the mistakes he had made. The river no longer carried only sorrow. It carried warning, memory, and the voice of justice. I never once spoke to him again. I never visited him in his cell. Though he begged for me in letters, I never answered. In the end, it was not my words he needed. It was hers. And she had already said everything she needed to in the silence that followed his crime. The last I ever heard of him was the night he died, alone in his prison, screaming into the darkness that she stood in the corner of his cell, waiting for him. They said he died with his eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a scream, arms stretched out as though trying to hold back the inevitable. But no one can hold back what they deserve. And so, his story ended where it began, on the edge of darkness, with the river calling his name. But her story, her spirit, her justice, it lived on. It lived in the whispers of the town, in the flowers at her grave, in the lessons carried by every soul who heard what had been done to her. It lived in me every day I breathed, and as long as I walked the earth, I would carry her memory, not as a shadow, but as a flame. Because vengeance is not only about punishment, it is about remembrance. And she, the woman he tried to erase, would never again be forgotten. The river kept flowing, but this time it carried her story with it, and the world listened.